Welcome, everyone. My name is Tom DeWolf, and I'm the program manager for Coming to the Table. I'm happy to welcome everyone here today for this session. The learning series that Coming to the Table has been putting on now for a couple of months. This is the third session. All these sessions are recorded for viewing on YouTube. And we've got more coming up in August on the 22nd on the Doctrine of Discovery. And then in September on the 27th, getting ready to publish your family history, which will follow up nicely on what we're working on today. So I want to begin by introducing the two co-facilitators who sort of lead the Linked Descendants working group. Prinny Anderson has been involved with Coming to the Table since its first meeting in 2006 and helped to start the Linked Descendants working group in 2012. She's very fortunate to have had relationships with a number of Linked Descendants for the last 20 years and resonates with the emotional challenges of doing research and making connections. Angela Dickey has been a member of Coming to the Table since 2016. And she enjoys helping Prinny manage the Linked Descendants working group and is also a member of the Mindfulness working group. When possible, she participates in the Annapolis, Maryland and Richmond, Virginia local groups. She's a member of the board of the Slave Dwelling Project. And with that, I will turn it over to Prinny.
Thank you, Tom. And hello, everybody. Names and faces I know and new names and faces. It's wonderful to see all of you here this afternoon. And I am going to share my screen so that you can see our plan for the afternoon. We're going to start off with a little poll that Tom's going to take everybody through so that our panelists have a sense of where you are, what you've been doing. And then we have 4 panelists: Antoinette Broussard, Will Wingfield, Leslie Stainton, and Sharon Morgan. And I'll introduce each of them when they're about to start. Tom, can you run the poll?
It is running. We've already got people answering.
Excellent.
And there's the results.
Ooh, that's very interesting. So we're kind of 2 big groups, some people who are very new and some people who've been doing this a long time. So I think the information our panelists will share is going to be useful to both of those groups. And then a good variety of causes for meltdown, and there are probably other reasons that you've been frustrated and upset with your research process that we didn't even cover here. But this gives us a little bit of a picture of who's here and what you've been up to. And our first panelist is Antoinette Broussard. Antoinette is a writer and a researcher. Her work centers on documenting her ancestral roots. She's the author of African American Holiday Traditions, published by Citadel Press, and she's contributed to various different publications, including the African American National Biography, which is edited by Henry Louis Gates, and she's contributed to Harlem of the West. And she has a chapter called Shared Legacies of Race and Reconciliation in the Slavery's Descendants book. So Antoinette, if you would unmute yourself and take it away.
Okay. I'm Antoinette Broussard, farmer. You see farmer up there. I didn't want it to confuse anybody. I'm giving a story, telling a story about my Craig descendants. And Prinny's going to put up a picture in a few minutes. But there were no records before 1870 on my relatives. And that's a real frustration. Of course, I did find a cemetery record that gave me a clue I did find a death certificate that gave me a clue. I did find newspapers, some things in the newspapers that helped me. I researched, well, my great-grandmother, Violet, she was owned by William Payne Wallingford in Platte County, Missouri. She was enslaved by him. This is Violet that comes up at the top of the picture. Her name is Violet Craig Turner. She was born in Kentucky in 1828. I have really no idea where she was born. She and her 5 brothers and her mother were born in Kentucky. This is one of her children, my grandfather, Barry Benjamin Craig. He was born in 1863, at the end of 1863, almost a year after the Emancipation Proclamation had been, been out, and he was born into an enslaved family. This is his youngest sister, Nettie Craig Asbury, and she was born in July of 1865, and she was the only one out of 8 children that were Violet's children that was born free in Leavenworth, Kansas. To the right is their father, William Payne Wallingford. He was born in 1820 in Maysville, Kentucky. I can take Wallingford's lineage from Kentucky back to Virginia, all the way back to England. And I'm unable to get my family past 1870 for the most part. I researched William P. Wallingford, who is my biological great-grandfather. I researched his history, his land records, his court records, and so on, to try to get a clue as to where he got Violet from. I've even researched his father's record, the senior Wallingford, John Wallingford from Maysville, Kentucky. And I got a copy of his will when the senior Wallingford died in 1833, and he lists about 25 or 30 slaves. There's a slave on there, enslaved person on there named America. Violet named her first child America. There's a slave named Martha. Violet named her second daughter Martha. There's a slave named Frank, and there's a slave named Joseph. She named her sons these names. And so I think that when names are repeated, it's a clue. All the slaves on the senior Wallingford's inventory are named except for one young little girl in 1833 who would have been Violet's age. So I'm just trying to find out where Violet came from in Kentucky. William P. Wallingford left Maysville, Kentucky, and came with a number of other families to Platte County, Missouri in 1837, and he settled on the Platte Purchase. I researched those families who have, they all have glowing histories. They traveled down the river, the Mississippi, down the Missouri rivers on flatbed boats with their families and slaves, and they carved out these communities in Platte County, Missouri, that they're considered pillars, pioneers of this community, but they all enslaved people. And that's my meltdown. I have to research these people to try to get a clue as to where Violet came from and her 5 brothers, who were all enslaved with different slave owners in Missouri. Violet appears in the 1850 slave schedule as, well, a Black woman appears in William Wallingford's slave schedule in Platte County, Missouri in 1850, a Black woman Violet's age, with a 9-year-old girl, that Black girl who is also owned by William P. Wallingford. I have never figured out if that child was Violet's. In 1860, Violet, in the 1860 slave schedule, under William P. Wallingford, Violet again appears, Black woman, her age, but with mulatto children. And the 9-year-old girl, who would have been 19 by then, has disappeared. Maybe she was sold, maybe she died, maybe she was rented out. In 1865 or late 1864, when Violet was pregnant with Nettie, they left Wallingford's farm. They weren't freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. They were freed, I believe, by the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in 1865 by the states. My meltdown, my resentment is that I have to research people who are considered pillars of the community. These people who settled in Platte County turned out to be judges and lawyers and Christian ministers, and William P. Wallingford's brother, who came with him from Kentucky to Platte County, was a sheriff, and he owned a 15-year-old black girl in the 1850 slave schedule. The positive thing for me was that I could see in the 1870 census and after that, where Violet had settled with her children on her own. She left Wallingford's farm. She may be a year and a half years old, and she left with 4 other mulatto children. And another child was missing, and its family oral history was that William P. Wallingford had sold that child. So she settled across the river when she was freed, and she rendezvoused, and I can tell from the address directories that began to come out, she gradually rendezvoused with her 5 other brothers and their families. And a positive thing for me is that as a child, I always said, I'm going to find Wallingford. I kept hearing this oral history, but I said, I'm going to find him. And as you know, he died in 1875. He was a wealthy man. He owned 10 farms. He left everything to his 10 white children and his 3rd wife. But I said I was going to find Wallingford because I want them to know that we exist. I don't need to be, included as part of that family, but I need them to know this history. And I posted on a genealogy board, a Wallingford genealogy. I was looking for Wallingfords in this specific area around Platte County and Buchanan. And who I was introduced to were 2 sisters, the great-granddaughters of William P. Wallingford. And what's a bit healing for me is that I've come to know them. And I've been invited and I've stayed with them a few times when I've researched history in Missouri and Kansas. And what I found were 2 loving sisters.
Thank you very much, Antoinette.
You're welcome.
For your stories. They're very heartfelt for me, and I'll look forward to hearing the kinds of questions that people have when we get to the Q&A. Our next speaker is Will Wingfield, Mr. Wingfield. Will is a resident of Wake County, North Carolina. He's a descendant of one of the first families of colonizers to arrive in North America, and he's been researching his own lineage and his ancestors' involvement in slavery for more than 10 years. Take it away, Will.
Everybody hear me? It's nod, thumbs up. Okay. Antoinette, I would like to first just thank you for sharing your story. And I think I know why Prinny and Angela put me behind you is because I'm the other side of that story. I am from one of those families that you referred to, like the Wallingfords, and it's difficult to try to understand and rectify everything that your ancestors have been a part of. And so I appreciate you sharing what you did. As Prinny mentioned, I've been researching the genealogy of my family for a long time. I look at the process of it as a journey that you never really complete, especially as it pertains to the institution of slavery here in the United States. One of the main reasons is that 1870 wall that we were talking about earlier. But for me, what happens is every rabbit hole that I go down opens up 5 more rabbit holes, and I end up just finding more stuff to research and to try to track down. But talking about my probably most emotional breakdown, it was really when I came to the realization and the truth of what my ancestors and lineage had been a part of. As Antoinette was talking about with the Wallingfords, I come from a family that's got a very proud history. We can trace, there's a Wingfield Family Historical Society and lots of other stuff out there. I can trace my lineage all the way back to the southern region of Suffolk, England, around the time of 1080 AD. And that's a luxury that I didn't realize a lot of people don't have the ability to do until I got older. Just having that knowledge of identity from where your ancestors came from, it's something that was stolen from all of the people who were enslaved and brought to this country. So that was one of the I guess epiphanies for me when I started getting into it. So as I mentioned, grew up, with a proud family history. The first president of the Jamestown colony that landed in Virginia in 1607 was Edward Maria Wingfield. My ancestors have been here ever since. So long time, which gave them a long time to colonize things and a long time to enslave people. I knew from a young age, because of that history, that my ancestors had probably been involved in the institution of slavery, but I'd never tied it together and actually seen any concrete proof or evidence. It was just a logical conclusion based on the knowledge of how early my ancestors got here and the areas that they lived in and just the time frame. But in my late 20s, I'm 39 now, in my late 20s, I was actually contacted by somebody who was researching her lineage. She was probably 10, 15 years older than me, and she had been digging through her history for years. She had hit that 1870 wall and had actually reached out and contacted me through LinkedIn. It was, very brave on her part to just try to, but she asked me if I was related to certain people, ancestors of mine that I knew I was. And then she told me, and I didn't speak to her about this panel, so I'm not going to reveal her name or that aspect of it, but just so people are aware, I'm going to be a little vague about her. I'll be specific about my family, but I didn't clear anything with her, so I don't want to share anything that she may not be comfortable with. But she asked me, she told me she had hit a roadblock with her great-great-great-grandfather, James. And James was her maternal great-grandfather. She couldn't find out anything about him other than he was a slave from Northwest Georgia who'd been owned by an Archibald Wingfield. Archibald was my great-great-great-grandfather. I'm sorry, I didn't do PowerPoints or anything, but, proud family history. So those first 3 individuals you see there in that image were all slave owners. Archibald, the one we're talking about, is there at the beginning. So that caused me, when she contacted me and explained her circumstances, I felt compelled for many reasons just to try to help. And that was the spark that really caused me to dig down into my family history, specifically regarding the institution of slavery. Not so much about where I'd come from, the lineage going back to England or anything like that, but specifically, what did my ancestors do during that period from, say, 1607 when they first arrived all the way through the end of the Civil War. So we started digging, and she actually, unfortunately, ended up educating me more than I was able to educate her. She had done a lot more research at that point than I had and knew more than I did. Unfortunately, we were not able to go back beyond 1870, but I was able to close a few gaps and confirm that Archibald Simpson did indeed own her great-grandfather at one point, and that he had actually bequeathed that individual to his son, Samuel Barnett. So we were able to create a little more history regarding her great-great-grandfather, but weren't able to break back through that wall of 1870. After that, what became very upsetting to me was that I knew, as I mentioned earlier, that my family had most likely been involved, and now I had confirmation that they were involved. But you never, I guess you always try to internalize things in a minimalist way so that you don't feel as bad about them yourself. So I started to do the research. It was a lot more. My family's involvement in the institution of slavery was a lot more prevalent than I had ever anticipated. Archibald himself had, at one point when he passed, according to his will, 83 slaves. Another one of my ancestors had 66. They were prolific, what they called the planning class, which I think is a term we need to get rid of because it minimizes what they really were. They were enslavers, they were slave owners. But that was the breakdown for me, is coming to the realization that it wasn't, and it's a harsh reality that I think a lot of people aren't willing to face, but it wasn't that, yeah, maybe one of my ancestors somewhere had a slave. No, like every member of the family was very involved. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, Louisiana, and Northwest Georgia, Wilkes County, Georgia, and Washington, Georgia is, like Antoinette was mentioning about the Wallingbergs, there's my family's name all over things. But every single one of those family members they're talking about was a slave owner. And that's a reality that's hard to accept sometimes. I'll end there because I'm running out of time.
Thank you very much, Will. And I imagine there are quite a few of us who, listening to your story, who have had that moment of realizing how extensive our enslaver family's involvement was and being shocked and distressed by that. Our next panelist is Leslie Stainton. I'll introduce her and then start sharing my screen so you can see the images that go with her story. Leslie lives in Ann Arbor, Michigan. She teaches at the University of Michigan Residential College. She's published 2 nonfiction books and numerous essays and articles. Now she's at work on a book about her slaveholding ancestors, the Scarlets of Glynn County, Georgia. She serves on the board of the Slave Dwelling Project and is a past board member of Coming to the Table.
Thanks, Prinny. Will and Antoinette, thank you for your presentations, and both of them are just such reminders of the terrible and deep wound that this history has caused on all sides of the story. I'm honored to be presenting with you and with Sharon today. Prinny, if you're able to pull up the slides, and I just want to say that every time I say next slide to you, there's an implicit please and thank you in there, but I'll delete those words for efficiency's sake. Okay. So
Okay.
got it?
Got it.
This is fine, however you want to do it. Yeah. So my story begins with this man, my great-great-great-grandfather, Francis Muir Scarlett. He was a slaveholder in Brunswick, Georgia. And for decades, that's all I knew, that my ancestors were slaveholders. There were no plantation records. The history was buried. And so far as my family was concerned, we were good slaveholders. The one thing I did have, next slide, please. There's a please. The one thing I did have were boxes of documents that I inherited from my grandmother. And I've come to think of these unopened boxes as a metaphor for this whole sort of tricky business, this terrible history that we keep passing on without bothering to find out what's inside the boxes. I don't know how many of you have inherited documents from family, but these boxes that I got from my grandmother sat unopened in my closets for years and years and years. Next slide. But about 10 years ago, I decided it was finally time to open the boxes, and so I did. And the first what I found were just pretty benign stuff, you know, sympathy letters, ancestral photographs, obituaries. Next slide. And then I found this. I found letters written to my great-great-great-grandfather, Francis Muir Scarlett, when these letters informed me that my great-great-great-grandfather was actually an overseer before he became a slaveholder. And that was news to me. I hadn't known that. The letters informed him how he needed to feed the quote-unquote Negroes on the plantation for which he was an overseer. He was to feed them dry corn, not green, because it would make them sick. And so that told me that they were treated like farm animals in many ways. And that was my first significant shock. And it lingered for a long time. Next slide, please. Another document that I found in my grandmother's boxes was this is just a page of it, but an oral account describing how my same great-great-great-grandfather, Francis Muir Scarlett, purchased an enslaved African man in 1858 from the illegal slave ship, the Wanderer. The account was sickening. You may be able to read a little bit of it here. But the most sickening part was the revelation towards the end of this account that my great-great-great-grandfather took this man, this African man whom he bought in 1858, and subsequently leased him to fellow planters in Glynn County at $100 a day as a quote-unquote producer of children. So this is another pretty shocking discovery. I would say every time I made a discovery like this, my reaction was kind of the same. I would feel this like clench in my gut, sharp intake of breath. I would often like be standing at my computer in my office and I would just say out loud, are you kidding me? I'll spare you the profanity, but I bet you can guess. I kept digging. I moved from physical boxes to Ancestry.com, to periodicals, to online databases, to archives. And I found a bunch of stuff. Next slide. I found shipping manifests like this, where my ancestors were shipping enslaved people, frequently people who had run away. I found want ads for runaways. I found ads where my ancestors wanted to buy 100 Negroes, that's in quotes. Next slide. I found deeds and mortgages where my ancestors used enslaved people as collateral. I found inventories like this one of the enslaved people. You can see we were major slaveholders with about, at our peak, about 500 people. Yeah, and so these are some of the names of the people that were passed on at when ancestors died. This is an estate inventory. Along the way, I began reading books about slavery. I read about the plantation economy. I read about the Great Migration. I began to piece together the way my family must have conducted business, and it wasn't pretty. I joined Coming to the Table. Next slide. I joined, thanks to Prinny's, the Slave Dwelling Project. You can see my camping gear here. This was last year in Kentucky. Next slide. I reached out to the descendants of people my ancestors had enslaved. The story of how we met and how I found them is too complicated to go into here. But suffice it to say, I went to their family reunion in 2011. This is this wonderful, beautiful woman named Avadel Grant, who has since died. But I have become good friends of several members of this family. And this has been, as Antoinette said in her case too, an unexpected and extraordinary blessing that's come out of this difficult work. Little, if any, of this work has been in my comfort zone. I don't think I've taken a single research trip south without wishing I weren't going. Next slide, even reading books like Edward Baptist's The Half Has Never Been Told is uncomfortable because of the discoveries that you make when you read these books and of what those discoveries imply about what your family did. But I've learned to say to myself, so what if you're out of your comfort zone? Look what your ancestors did to all those people. Your discomfort is nothing compared to theirs. One way I've dealt with my discomfort is to keep a journal where I record with as much detail as I can remember what I have found and how that knowledge has affected me. Because I write, that's been very helpful, but it's also just been helpful to sort of digest and absorb and recall that material. Next slide. I have also published essays about what I've found. This is an essay in the Sun magazine a couple years ago. I've spoken at conferences. I've shared stories in venues like this. I've served on the boards of Coming to the Table and the Slave Dwelling Project. Helped organize a social justice ministry at my church where we're really concentrating on racial justice. This is not to toot my horn, but just to suggest that there are constructive ways of dealing with the difficult discoveries that we make and of trying to turn this very unwelcome information into some kind of a force for change. Next slide. Sadly, the history of my family's crimes does not end with slavery. Just this past February, I discovered a horrific story about a young Black man named Fricey Griffin. You can see his picture here. It breaks my heart. He was hanged in Brunswick, Georgia in 1901. And one of my scarlet ancestors, a cop, of course, right? Policeman, was very much behind his death, which was a legal hanging in name only. I tracked this story, and I want to thank Karen Brannon, who's on this call, for her help with this. I tracked this story in the local newspaper and through trial transcripts, and it is a sordid story that involves those old topics, reward money and sex. And as I worked through this difficult material just a couple of months ago, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night thinking about Griffin, who was so clearly framed and killed for it. I felt as if he were alive, as if these events were happening now in 2020. And then, next slide, please. Something did happen in 2020. Ahmaud Arbery went for a jog in a neighborhood in Brunswick, Georgia. The neighborhood was called Satilla Shores, and you all know what happened. He was murdered by 2 white vigilantes. So I took out my maps, and I discovered that Mr. Arbery was indeed, as I suspected, killed on land that used to belong to my slaveholding scarlet ancestors, land where they hunted and abused hundreds of people of color. The line between what my family did in the 19th and 20th centuries and what happened to Ahmaud Arbery is direct and clear. And so I just want to close by saying we have to get out of our comfort zones. We have to keep opening those boxes. We have to expose this traumatic history because, as the events of this summer show, this history is still happening. Last slide. Thanks for listening. I welcome your comments and questions, and please feel free to email me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for your thoughts and also for sharing the stories and for the very painful link to 2020. And our last panelist is Sharon Morgan. So Sharon, if you would unmute yourself and take it away.
I'm at a loss because hearing these stories induces an incredible amount of emotion in me. I am so happy to see, I don't know if happy is the right word, but it is wonderful to see white people actually dealing with this. The journey that I've been on for most of my life in researching my family has had so many roadblocks and brick walls, starting with my father's resistance to even tell me anything about about his family. And I realized one day that a woman that I had been introduced to as a 3-year-old child, he finally told me, this is my great grandmother, that she had been enslaved. And I could never talk to her, but it meant a lot because as I continued my research, I realized how painful those memories must have been. He grew up with her, and it told me that slavery is not that far in the past. It existed in my lifetime. A human being existed in my lifetime who had been enslaved. One of the biggest emotional moments beyond that was when I found my very first slave schedule. And I was sitting in the archives in Alabama, and I found the schedule, and I started crying. And the docent hugged me and said, everybody has that reaction. It's like, it's awful. You see the slave schedule, you have no idea who they are because there's no name. There's just a tick for male, female, black, age. And so it was really very profound for me. And then I continued researching and hit the 1870 brick wall, where prior to 1870, Black people had no surnames. And trying to piece together our families and realizing that we lost 10 generations of people. White people can be traced back, as several of you have just said, to the 1600s. We can't go back that far. And it's awful because we just do not know who we came from. Those 10 generations, my great grandparents, I know they must have had siblings. I know they had parents, but they're not in records anywhere that I can piece together. So that's really awful. We can only make educated guesses about who we belong to, and that is really daunting because you don't have the documentation. Slavery was built the entire economy of the Western world. And it is amazing to me that human beings, astute human beings like Thomas Jefferson, could claim these lofty philosophical principles and yet enslave people. That Thomas Jefferson could present a formula for how you should invest in slaves because they will return, they will have great returns on your investment. And so I continue to be very upset, angry, sad, and have huge amount of emotion about what happened. So much so that that is how I came to coming to the table, trying to find a place to put my emotion because it was so awful. And I fortunately found a way with Tom DeWolf to be able to put that in a place where I can go on. So I'm not quite sure what else to say, except our past is horrific. It is horrific to be able to compromise your morals and own human beings, to deprive me of my ability to know where I came from. But we have to move past that and make a place of healing where that history is then, and now what do we do with it? So with Black Lives Matter, we have to stand up, stand tall, and like John Lewis said, you know, we have to do the good fight. And I'm really conflicted right now in this conversation because it's really rising a lot of emotion in me. I'm writing a book about my ancestors at this moment, and it just evokes so much horror and pain that I'm really trying to get over. And now I shall unmute.
Sharon, thank you. And I have to apologize because I didn't say anything about who you are and what you do. Sharon is, as she's indicated, a very long time member of Coming to the Table. She's a writer and a genealogist, and she's the founder of Our Black Ancestry, which is an online community dedicated to African American family research. And I wonder, Sharon, because there are a couple more minutes of time that you could use, if you'd like to say a little bit about the kinds of tools or support systems that are available through Our Black Ancestry for anybody on this call, or the friends of anybody on this call that is trying to get past that brick wall.
My work with Our Black Ancestry, I did so much research on my family that I'm not a trained genealogist. I'm self-trained genealogist. So I formed this community, and I now have 35,000 people on Facebook, which is really interesting to keep up with. And obviously, there are so many Black people researching where they came from and who they belong to. So it's been really a good experience, but very frustrating, because as Black people research their genealogy, we end up having to research the white people who owned us. And so that is very problematic. But it is what it is. Okay, so I'm hoping that we can form bonds because of the research that help people connect on both sides. In my family, my great grandmother had 17 children with a white man. So I can trace him back to the 1600s when they arrived in America as indentured servants and ended up being able to achieve prosperity in Mississippi, in South Carolina and Mississippi. And I am very frustrated because the people that they enslaved, there are very few records about them. So our Black ancestry is a way of trying to connect those dots. So hopefully we will, find information. So I want to say this now. Any of you who have information about your enslavers or enslaved people, communicate and be able to connect those dots.
Thank you. And if people Google our Black ancestry, they'll find both the website and the Facebook group if they want a way to follow up on your request. Would that be?
Yes.
Okay.
And it's been really interesting because during COVID, I have had many requests from people who are on lockdown and obviously bored, and they are white people who are saying, I would really like to explore this history. So that's been very heartening to me.
Yay, I'm glad. I'm glad. So what we're going to do now is go into small group conversation, the purpose of which is to give folks a little bit of a chance to share with each other some key thing that you heard, but also to, is there a question that you would like to ask one or more of the people on the panel? So Tom will be putting people into groups of 4 for 15 minutes, and please talk about what you heard you want to know more about, and be ready to write your questions into chat when Zoom brings you back.
All right. Let me see. I don't know exactly who to give this to, but the question is, what is the point of view a white person can take when trying to get the information out about?
That's a typo. It's African American, African American.
Okay, African American people who were enslaved, because we want to avoid centering ourselves as white people. Let me throw that to Will. You want to answer that question?
There we go. Just want to make sure I'm going to repeat the question to make sure I'm understanding it correctly. So what point of view should we take as white people when we uncover the information about our the enslavement that our ancestors have done?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Kay. I was the one that was trying to frame it. I'm finding, particularly with one family, that I can trace people through generations for like 50 years.
Wow.
And trying to get that kind of thing consolidated and out. I have a blog, and that's one place that I share this. I'm trying to make sure that I can share the story without it coming back. It feels oftentimes very awkward as I do it. I guess that's what I'm.
Yeah, no, it does. I mean, it will continue to. What we're learning about our ancestors is not pleasant. And actually, I think I would question myself if I ever got comfortable with learning about these things. But you mentioned a blog. That's what I did when I first started learning about this stuff, was compiling as much of it as I could. A blog is a great way to do it. So you're capturing it and cataloging it as you go along. What I would ask, have you mentioned a family that you've been able to find like 5 generations of. Have you looked within any of the groups or organizations like CTT or Ancestry to see if anybody from that family is doing the same thing on that end? Has anybody?
Yeah, I joined our Black Ancestry, and
okay.
I just found on Facebook, I've traced my ancestors, I think is the name of it. And I thought I would put out feelers and say, I've got this information if anybody would like to.
Yeah.
Um,
If you're courageous, if you're willing to do that, I mean, it is a courageous process to put yourself out there like that, and I would encourage you to do it. But at the very least, you're documenting, and that's honestly what's most important for me. I think the sense of urgency I have with this stuff is that we already see how much of it has already disappeared. If we don't, capture as much of it as we can right now, every day that goes by, more and more of it is being permanently erased. So, continue to do what you're doing. Put it out. Look, I would set out feelers. You may not find them though. There are. I have encountered people who were not ready yet to, and I totally understand this. They were not ready to meet the descendants of the people who had enslaved their descendants. They were not ready to really have that conversation.
Yeah, I've just got a lot of information about the slaveholders, and I can see the enslaved and their kids through generations of my ancestors' documents.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think.
Can I jump?
Yeah, let's give it to Sharon
Sorry.
for a minute. Sharon runs this database to help people find the information.
Okay.
Okay, so I have the Our Black Ancestry website, and I have a Facebook group that has more than 35,000 people.
Okay, and that's what I need.
Researching their family histories. And it is interesting because many people want to know their relationship with white people, but there are many people who do not want to know that because it is very painful. So our website, no hate, no ugly, no anything bad. So I urge everybody to join. It's free. And if you post information about your ancestors who enslaved people, often we have found connections. And so that is a very good thing. Like I started with, there's really mixed emotions about this because like I felt many years ago, hateful. It's like, I hate these people. How could they possibly have done this? And being so angry that you can't go forward. So I have this community where we're building it going forward, not with hate, but with love and respect and, and we just want to know. So our community on Facebook, no hate speech, no uglies. And it has been very helpful to many people.
Thank you, Sharon. I have one here from Kathy Saunders. How about Leslie? Do you have suggestions for descendants of enslavers approaching descendants of people their ancestors enslaved? Is that even a good idea? Should we just make the information available and let them come to us or proactively reach out?
I'm not an expert. I just have my own experience. I don't think there's one size fits all. In my case, I reached out to the family. I had some family letters that mentioned names. I spoke to a historian from the area who recognized some of the names and said, when she actually got it started, she said, these descendants would love to know this story. And so, and there wasn't even an email. I had to do it by phone. I mean, like, hi, you don't know me, but my ancestors enslaved yours. But my God, I don't know if I was lucky or what, but that family has been nothing but loving and caring from the get-go. I always, when I do meet somebody who is, a descendant of people, and I've met more people since, I always apologize. And I know from coming to the table groups that can be fraught. Some people don't want to hear an apology. All of this stuff is fraud. You screw up. You risk screwing up. But anyhow, I've always apologized, and then people have said, well, no, but that was a long time ago. I've had people say that to me a couple of times. That was a long time ago. And then I say, yeah, but it was really brutal. And then they say, yeah. And in this particular case, the woman said to me, but it does help with the healing. So I don't know that I don't have a one size fits all answer. I think I would say reach out and try. I guess to me, reaching out and trying is better than just assuming that they'll come find you, especially because we've got the other side. When often we have another side of the story, we have information about their family that they won't otherwise have. And it feels to me that that's a responsibility. If you have this information, it's your responsibility to try to get it out. I guess I would say that. I don't know. I'd love to hear from other people, and especially from African Americans. How do you want us? What do you want?
My experience has been with everybody on lockdown because COVID, I've had a rush of white people whose ancestors were slaveholders wanting to connect. And I've been able to make many connections with that. It is very important how you approach it, because I think mostly it's such a big head bomb that you don't know what to do with it. So you have to approach it gingerly. And there are things on the Coming to the Table website that will help you negotiate that. But I have had many successful, if we can call them reunions, of people who are trying to make amends by presenting the information, and Black people willingly accepting that. So I think read the stuff on the Coming to the Table website and approach it in that way. Because it is a bomb. It's like, hey, my people enslave your people. So, you kind of have to get through that.
Thanks, Sharon.
Can I make a comment?
Is that Antoinette?
Yes.
The next question, but go ahead on this one too.
Oh, I was just going to say, I want you to reach out to me, because I feel like from an African American, my side, going to the white side, I feel like they're very reluctant, they're very reluctant for whatever reason, but if you have information, if you're connected to me, please reach out. I want that.
This is Bernice. I want to say something also. I totally agree with you. If you all have information, share that information. I know the very first time I met a descendant, she shared that information. She shared the information, and I met her on the exact same day. And the only thing I want to say is, do not allow fear to prevent you from doing the right thing. Don't worry about it, because people want to know. Believe me, they want to know. And if you have the information and you're just holding it, it's not helping anybody.
Mm-hmm.
So get it out there. And as Sharon mentioned, she has our Black ancestry. I'm part of this group called the Midwest African American Genealogy Institute. That's what we talk about. We talk about making sure that information gets out there and looking at every kind of database that you can find so that you can make sure that people do have the information.
Thanks, Bernice and Antoinette.
Can I make a comment? I'm Martha, and I think as long as you approach it authentically, I think it's an act of radical love when you try to connect and let them know, the information. And that's all I have to say.
I actually met a descendant of the slave owners that owned my family, and it was wonderful to meet her. She apologized on behalf of her family. I was happy for that. However, I did want to have a look in their records, because I'm sure that they have records And unfortunately, I was unable to do that because the people that keep the records for the family members is not that open as this young lady was that I met.
Mm-hmm.
So I would welcome more information. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions about the relationship between trauma and slavery. And what are some of the ways that you handle the emotional repercussions of doing this work? Is there anyone of the four panelists who would like to talk about that? Antoinette, could you speak to that?
To handle repercussions from, you mean people on the other side? Is that?
No, I mean, your own emotional reactions to doing the work, which may be, you might classify as traumatic, but the whole subject of slavery is traumatic for the country. So how do you, would you like to comment on how you might handle that? How do you, are there things that you do to calm yourself down while you do the work? You just keep on doing the work. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay.
So I've been researching for approximately, I guess, 18 years. I always heard the story as a child, though, about my great-grandmother Violet, and then she was owned by W.P. Wallingford from Platte County, Missouri. And don't you forget it, it was nice. I was, always curious about it. And when I started researching it, I got very angry as an adult. And finally I said, because I am a writer, I said, if you're going to write about something, you're going to have to deal with your anger, because you can't write objectively if you don't deal with your anger. And so I just, even though I resent, and I really resent having to trace these people's, hear all about their glowing histories and what great people they were, though they were enslavers. I just tried to make peace with it so I can represent my family the way they chose me to represent them in my writing.
Someone recommended My Grandmother's Hands as a good book for everybody in dealing with this, in dealing with the trauma. Let's see what else we have here. Yeah, Bernice, don't let fear of disclosure prevent you from sharing information the descendants want to know. I appreciate, here's from Noel. Noel, I appreciate especially the connections between our ancestry and current anti-racism work that Leslie brought to the conversation. I think she means a descendant. As a descendant of a Confederate war hero who was an enslaver that is honored by a monument in my community, can anyone speak to using our ancestry in the effort to dismantle monuments and statues? Anybody want to take that on?
Could I just pop in and say one thing about how you deal with trauma? Or what?
Sure. And then answer that question too, if you would.
Yeah, right. I just wanted to say that one of the extraordinary things that's come out, I think I deal with it by speaking out as much as I can in my way. I'm not a huge activist, but I write, I do stuff like this. One of the incredible things that's come out of this is that I have learned about members of my white family who care deeply about these issues. Are members of, Black Lives Matter, et cetera. And I had no idea that they were involved in anti-racist work. So that's been extraordinary, just to speak the truth about our family history and find out that these sort of distant cousins that I had no idea share these values. I've also found out, there are people who won't speak to me, and that's just part of it. And you got to deal with that. On the monuments, I will just say that we're grappling with this. The federal building in downtown Brunswick is actually named after a very segregationist judge who was my grandmother's cousin, his Frank Scarlett. It's the Frank Scarlett building. And he single-handedly, or sort of single-handedly, managed to keep the Savannah schools segregated for 10 years after Brown v. Board of Education. And at some point, I would like to do something to try to take that name down, but I think, yeah, anyhow, it's complicated. I'm not sure I'm a good person to ask. I think that the monument story is really complicated, and I think one of the things I'm hearing here in this group is this deep appreciation for the history. As Will said, it's disappearing by the minute, and so you know, I don't want to see all the history just destroyed either. You know, there are really important, painful stories that, I mean, for instance, on a Zoom call the other night with Slave Dwelling Project, people were talking about plantations. People are trying to burn down plantations, and you think, you know, that's evidence of what happened. So I'll just, that's my malformed answer to that question, but it's really complicated to me.
Tanya Singer wanted to speak to that question as well about the monuments. Is that right, Tanya?
Right. I can't speak specifically to monuments, but the ancestors I'm studying in New England who were enslavers, there's a historic home. They sold their home for $1 to the Society of Colonial Dames, who run it as a museum. So when I first learned about this, it's building a partnership. If anyone else has a place that's a historic home or place like that, building a partnership there has been really rewarding. And just this last week, actually, I first reached out to many distant cousins who I had not met yet, other white people in my family who I did not know. But the purpose of this call was to bring them into dialogue with the historian of the home, who is committed and has actually applied for a grant to reinterpret the home, to tell the story, to humanize the story. And really, in this case, it's a story of New England complicity in the entire slave trade, all generations of slavery in the South. The story is there in that home. So what I think the question was, how can you leverage your position as a descendant? It's been good, because there have been times where there's fear. I don't know if the Society for Colonial Dames will go for that, or the new boss, or what the descendants will say. And so I can say, how can I help? Like, I'm not an employee, I'm a descendant. And so I can help by bringing people together. I can help by offering to meet with the tour guides and meet with Society for Colonial Dames, you know, doing the work myself to help this one person in that organization deal with the fragility and resistance that's coming up around the work that she's ready to do.
There's a lot of, thank you, Tanya. There's a lot of conversation going on in the chat now about the question raised about the monuments and the different perspectives on the monuments, which obviously we have in the group, the full range of views. And just know that Tom is recording all of this, and I hope we'll also have a record of the chat, the comments that were offered in the chat, Tom.
Yes, we will.
Okay.
We'll save that as well. And just wanted to highlight these 2 books that have been talked about by a number of people in regards to trauma awareness, trauma healing, and understanding trauma and ways to be resilient in the face of it. So I wanted to pop these 2 books up on the screen for people as well.
Yes, and as several of us in the group have been through the STAR training at Eastern Mennonite University, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Healing, which is really great. If you haven't taken it, we all recommend it, I think. Let's see, going back to, let me see what some other themes in the questions. Obviously, yeah, there's just a lot of commentary about how we deal with the history of these monuments. And someone asked a very simple question, but an important question, which is, what is a slave census? Can you take that, Sharon? The slave schedules, I'm sorry. What are the slave schedules?
I could tell you that if Sharon's not available.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chip.
Okay, the slave schedules are taken before the 1870s. The slave schedules will list all of this, like if you have a slave owner, and it lists all the slaves that slave owner has, but it only lists the slaves as the sex, the age, and their race. That's
Right.
it. No names or anything, but it's listed under the slave owner's name, and it's taken every 10 years prior to up until 1860, which is the last slave schedule. And then in 1870, the census included black people that were all free, because before the 1870s, it was only the free people. And if there were black free people before 1870 or the 1860 census, they would be listed with their names. But if they weren't free, they were slaves, they would just be a tick mark, as Sharon told you earlier. And that's on the slave schedule.
I would amend that to say every U.S. federal census documented slaveholding.
Right.
So from 1790, which was the first census, all the way through until 2020, which we're dealing with now, every one of them said that whether or not people own slaves. What people miss when they look at the record is that they look at one page and they don't go to a second page, which is where the slaves are. In 1850 and 1860, there was a separate schedule that enumerated enslaved people, and they were not documented by name. It would be a tick that said male, female, their age, their color. And so those are unique. And it is interesting to note that Congress actually had a very big debate about whether or not to include names on those schedules. And they decided not to, because they would humanize the people who were enslaved and give them the respect that they were due as human beings. So those are really profound schedules. And that is the one that made me cry when I first found one in Montgomery, Alabama.
Yes. Thank you, Sharon.
This is an interesting question. Are there any legal considerations in trying to research or publicize, get the word out about specific enslavers? And someone also asked, is there a database that keeps the names of enslavers? Anybody have an answer on that?
Run that, ask that question.
Yeah, I have a book on enslaved people, enslavers' names in Louisiana. So I've seen books on that.
Yeah.
There is oh God, I'm going to blank on his name, but there's a guy who put out a database of major enslavers. And I think, anybody familiar with this one? I could look
Blake.
it up.
Tom Blake did a study that compared the 1870 census with surnames of people who were enslaved with the names of enslavers. So that's the only one that I am aware of. There is no universal list of everybody who was a slaveholder. What you have to do to find that is to go to your county of interest, look at the actual slave schedule for 1850 and 1860, and you will find their names there.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that there are some areas where people have done the research and compiled a huge amount of information. Look, for example, my ancestors down in Wilkes County, Georgia, Washington, Wilkes County, there's been a lot of research done and documentation, but not anything that's universal across the entire country. So it'd be great if that was something that somebody had the initiative to.
Other than the
launch.
Tom Blake study, which covers the 10 southern states, there is no other one that I am aware of.
The other thing you can do is, any book I'm looking like one of my, masters of the big house, whatever. I often look in the indices, but again, it's if you're looking for specific names. But the names do turn up in a lot of, just histories of the period and of slaveholding. I wonder.
And then you look at the records of, there's a book, I'm not remembering the author now, but records of antebellum plantations. And the author, who is a female whose name I cannot remember, has documented where papers are for slave-holding families.
And I wondered on the question of any legal considerations in writing or talking about enslavers. I'm wondering, Tom, can I ask you, because you published a book about your slaveholding ancestors, did you run into legal issues at all? Or is it sort of statute of limitations, they were never charged with these crimes?
No, and they're all dead. So
screw them.
Well, I mean, I really have no compunction about spreading information about people who enslaved people. I mean, if we're going to be truth tellers, then let's be truth tellers, and particularly when it impacts people in our own families. We've got to be, not shy. This is the work. This is being at the table. This is the work.
Copyright laws exist for 72 years. So if you have information prior to 72 years, all of that is open for public dispensation.
This is Edith. I would just add, slavery was legal.
Yeah, it was.
So, what?
Legal and encouraged.
Yeah, sad but true. So publishing the name of someone who did something legal, I can't see how that could come back to you.
I have never run into a problem about revealing or publishing any information from those times, which are more than 130 years old.
I guess I would just wonder if you're talking about, in my case, the 20th century legacy, including this federal judge who, died in 1967. I don't know the answer to that. I guess I'll find out. But, would there be liable charges? I mean, part of me doesn't care, but.
The truth is the truth.
Yeah.
I would, that is really not on my radar as something that I would be worried about.
Yeah, I mean, there's family members that do not appreciate this information being out there. They don't want anything to do with it, but I figure that's their issue. We're dealing with openness and trying to uncover and acknowledge this history. We've got to do that, in spite of people's reluctance.
Sharon, I just wanted to add, I looked it up. It is the research about most of my ancestors from Wilkes County is actually done by Tom Blake too. So yeah, looking at the website.
There's some great comments in the chat, and I haven't read out all the questions, but we've captured the main themes. Another book that's been mentioned is Edward Ball's Slaves in the Family, who did a lot of research on his family in South Carolina. It's just an incredible book, and his appendix is just amazing, and gives you good ideas on how you might find things.
He has a new
and there
book
are many
coming
like
out.
that. There's Henry Wansick did the Harrisons, An American Family in Black and White. So there are several books out there. The Washingtons of Wessington. I mean, there are many at this point that are incredibly useful.
Angela, it's Prinny. And from my own family experience, I know that there are white families that where it gets sticky is when you get the information about the white enslaver, especially if it's a historically known character, having children with one or more of his enslaved women. And there are descendants who are very attached to the virtue of their white enslaver ancestors. I don't know that they will sue, but they will certainly cause a lot of stink if they can. So
You don't say, Prinny.
I don't say.
Oh, do I see David Works up in there?
Really? I can't imagine white
Oh,
Jefferson's raising
Lord.
a stink about anything.
So it's not legal, but it's not a legal problem, but it is messy, and you can find yourself thrown out of your white family. Just FYI.
Okay, we have something here. If we have found documents like wills that are available, what about or related to them? Should that be shared with our Black ancestry? I assume the answer is yes.
Yes.
Okay, here's the deal. Our Black ancestry is part of an advisory group for family search. They have a project that is called ROAR, Reclaiming Our African Roots. They are attempting to accumulate as many records as possible that document slaveholdings and the people who were enslaved. So I'm collecting those documents, and I will present them by the end of the year to ROAR, which hopes to put them online in 2021. So if you have, I have a template where you can fill in the information about the enslaved person's name, the owner, and where to find the record. If you email me at smorgan@ourblack.ancestry.com, I will send you the template. You send it back, I will send it to Family Search, and hopefully this is going to end up with being a massive database.
Also, there is the new museum in Charleston, South Carolina, which is supposed to open maybe 2 years.
Yes.
And they have a website now, and they are collecting information. If you send it, they will keep it.
They are part of the same group that I'm involved with Family Search. So all of this ends up being in one repository.
Sharon, is the website, does your website have that template?
No, you have to, you have to email me.
Okay. I'm on the website and just thought,
Okay.
oh, well, I'll just go to the website.
All right. No, sorry, it's not that easy.
Sharon,
Right.
is that template for, like, when I'm doing my research on, and I find an enslaver that, and I'm going through his records, and I'm just seeing names listed. I've been keeping my own little tally, not knowing if these people are related to me at all, but just recording it. Is your,
the template says
template set up
the
for
name of the enslaved person,
okay,
the owner, descriptions, and then a link to the source document.
okay, all right, good.
Right. So my question was about when those documents already exist online. They're not like original copies. Do you still want that sent in?
Yes, because the only way you get original copies is by actually going to the courthouses. What has happened now, because we have so many things online, is that you can actually link to a viable document. So if you go into Ancestry or Family Search and you look at a will, it will show you the will. Okay, so your link can be to the online document. It doesn't have to be to the picture in the courthouse, because that's online.
Okay, thank you.
And
I'll follow
Angela,
up.
if there's maybe one more question or two quick ones, we'll be wrapping up in just a few minutes.
Okay. Charlotte Bocage, I wanted to see if you had a question because Prinny alerted me to the fact you had a question and I missed your hand somehow. Do you still have a question?
No, I just wanted to comment on some of the things that were said earlier. And I had written in the chat room that Joe Mozingo wrote about his enslaved ancestor. And he is a white guy that is a surfer from Dana Point in California. And when he found that out, he thought it was very interesting because he went on a national Find My Ancestors kind of tour to get the reaction from his family members. And it's an absolutely wonderful book that I suggest people find out about it because it's his white reaction, which is very liberal and open-minded, and to his non-liberal and open-minded relatives who thought differently about having a Black ancestor back to the 1700s.
Is that the Pantico run?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I met a Mozingo recently in Noxubee County, Mississippi, who is
Yeah.
also Mozingo.
Yeah, that was
Really
one of his ancestors.
He actually knew his history.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So he was Joe Mozingo kind of person.
Yes.
A non-Joe Mozingo.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I wanted to say something about the monuments. I'm in Los Angeles, and our Coming to the Table group looked at Jeffrey Robinson from the ACLU and his take on the Confederacy. It's on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken. So I would suggest that all of the people who think that that the monuments are history, I would suggest that you watch that video and see the truth about what the history of those monuments really are. Was born in New Orleans, raised in Los Angeles because of Jim Crow. My mom looked like you, Angela, and yet she was a Black person and treated like a Black person, having to drink out of the colored fountains. And so when we came to Los Angeles because of Jim Crow, I went back to home because home is always New Orleans for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was really nice to see that not only was Lee Circle renamed something else, but Lee wasn't there anymore. And I was really glad to see that, you know, the pillar is there, but no more Lee. And I was very glad to see Lee wasn't there anymore. So the monuments aren't exactly what you think they are. So you need to be aware of that. I think
That's a whole nother conversation. We're trying to move the monument here in Noxubee County, Mississippi.
Yeah.
And my feeling about that is the UDC, which originally put them up, should be responsible for removing them. I do not think Black people should have to pay for it.
Right.
So they gave us an estimate of $50,000 to move Johnny Reb, relocate him to the cemetery. And like I said, Black people should not pay for that. I think somebody, UDC women, if they're trying to be any way politically correct right now, they should be paying for it.
Yeah, they tried to recruit me from my genealogy society here in Los Angeles.
Honey, they after me to join DAR, okay? So
yeah. Because when they found out that my 2 times great-grandfather built boats for the Confederacy for the whole month or two that New Orleans was part of the Confederacy, they said, "Oh, well, we want you to join." I said, "Well, I need to think about that. You know, I belong to an awful lot of organizations, so I copped out with that, but I am very willing to infiltrate if I have to."
Great, thank you, Charlotte. That will have to be our last comment. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for participating, everyone. For those who are watching the recording of this session, We encourage you to make sure that you're a member of Coming to the Table so that you receive email notifications about future sessions like this, learning sessions, as well as the monthly newsletter for local group meetings and other resources. Thank you very much to our panelists, to the facilitators, Prinny Anderson and Angela Dickey, and our 4 panelists, Leslie Stainton, Antoinette, Will, and Sharon. And thank you all for being here at the table. And we'll wrap up our session for today.
Yahoo!